السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. لعلنا اليوم نشهد جهودا حثيثة في التضامن مع القضية الفلسطينية التي باتت تتكشف في مجتمعات السكان الأصليين في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وأستراليا، وأصبحوا يربطون التضامن مع فلسطين المحتلة بالقضايا الاجتماعية والإنسانية والبيئية الملحة. ونتحدث اليوم عن هذه الجهود التي من شأنها أن تقوي العلاقة مع فلسطين من الداخل. معكم زينب صفار، تابعوا. أدعو الله أن يصبح التحرر أمرا ممكنا في أذهان جميع السكان الأصليين. هي عبارة لعلها تلخص النضال المستمر للسكان الأصليين في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وأستراليا، ولعل هذه الجهود تتضافر وتلتقي اليوم أكثر مع القضية الفلسطينية، حيث أصبحوا يربطون التضامن مع فلسطين المحتلة بالقضايا الاجتماعية والإنسانية والبيئية الملحة. بحسب أحد المنظمين في الأمة الحمراء أو The Red Nation، وهي تحالف من السكان الأصليين وسواهم من النشطاء في مختلف المجالات الذين يكرسون جهودهم لتحرير الشعوب الأصلية من الرأسمالية والاستعمار، والذين يميطون اللثام اليوم في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية عن وحشية ممارسات الشرطة التي باتت وباء ضد السكان الأصليين في البلاد. ويتابع أحد قادة الأمة الحمراء بالكشف عن واحدة من أخطر الأماكن التي تلتقي فيها أنظمة ترامب ونتنياهو، وهي برامج التبادل التي تجمع بين الشرطة ودوريات الحدود والFBI من الولايات المتحدة مع الجنود والشرطة ووكلاء الحدود وما إلى ذلك من إسرائيل، حيث يتم تشارك أسوأ الممارسات لتشجيع وتوسيع عمل الشرطة التمييزي والقمعي والعنفي في كلا البلدين. وتشمل هذه الممارسات عمليات الإعدام خارج نطاق القضاء، وسياسات إطلاق النار والقتل المتعمد من قبل الشرطة، والتنميط العنصري والتجسس والمراقبة على نطاق واسع، والترحيل والاحتجاز والهجمات على المدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان. القائدة الشابة والناشطة فانيسا ترنبول روبرتس، وهي شابة من السكان الأصليين في أستراليا، تتبنى التغيير عبر تغيير الحوار، وقد عملت إلى جانب حركة الجدات لإيقاف الإبعاد القسري للأطفال، وحركة فاير أي المقاومة بالمقاومة لتغيير الحوار للسكان الأصليين وغير الأصليين حول قضايا تنبع من الاستعمار، تخبرنا أكثر من الداخل عن الصدق والشغف لدى كل الأفراد الذين مورس بحقهم الكثير من انعدام المساواة، وعن نشاطها في هذا السياق.
So just before I begin, I want to acknowledge the land that we're on, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners, and I want to say thank you for having me.
Always welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. Back home, we always do an acknowledgement of where we are and where we're from. And obviously me being a visitor to this country, I need to acknowledge all of your team and all of the traditional owners of this country. So
most welcome.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, so as you mentioned, grandmothers of forced removals and FIRE, which is Fighting and Resistance Equally, they're two incredible activist groups that work hand in hand. So grandmothers of forced removals is our grandmothers that have come together to have the discussion around the forced removals of Indigenous children. So in our country, we still have today what we call a continued stolen generation. This stolen generation started when invasion happened in our country in 1788, which saw children, Indigenous children being removed from their families, assimilated into white society, disconnected from culture, disconnected from identity, and still today not knowing where they belong or finding their journey.
And this is what happened to you, part of it?
So part of my own journey, when I was 11 years old, I was also forcibly removed from my father. This didn't just stem from a one decision. This stemmed from obviously historical policies, and it also stemmed from racial profiling, which in our country begins the moment you are born. If you're an Indigenous baby who is born, you are profiled automatically at a hospital or an institution that you reside in, and then the system acknowledges that you're Indigenous, and then before you know it, there's caseworkers intervening in your life. Throughout your development, you'd say is caseworkers are constantly coming in and out of your home, and then they pick a time to come and remove you from your family. It's systematic racism, and it's profiling our Indigenous communities, and this happens in rural and remote communities, it happens in urban communities, and it happened obviously in my community, which saw me being removed from my father. So me working alongside the grandmothers of forced removals, it's not about me constantly sharing my story and what I come from. It's about ensuring that other young Indigenous children don't actually have to have this story, don't actually have to have the same narrative, because it's not right, and it's seeing young children disconnected from community, and the same situation that is happening here, which is seeing the Palestinian movement being forced into refugees, which what we call reservations, and assimilating into new societies and being disconnected from their land, is the same struggle that we face in our country. So being here and standing in solidarity with the Palestinian movement is something I take pride in. And as mentioned, the grandmothers of forced removals is literally about our elders in our community who have come together to start and change the narrative around this removal of children. They are the grandmothers who are passing it down to the young children, who are stepping in and saying, hey, stop taking our babies, stop taking our children. What you're doing is criminal. Mm-hmm. And so we stand and work together, and I like to stand on their leadership through where I go.
What about FIRE?
FIRE, so FIRE stands for Fighting in Resistance Equally. Just as it sounds, it's about fighting in resistance equally with all the movements and struggles. So we are much bigger when we are together with other minority groups, and that's something that I try and advocate for in changing that narrative. It's about coming together with those small numbers of different communities, cultures and ethnicities, because we have different struggles, but we share the commonality of knowing resilience and knowing resistance and knowing how to fight back when our government is oppressing us the way it does. And we know that as First Nations people across the globe that this is happening. Mm-hmm. We know the answers, and the government fear that. That's why the political leadership is so poor. That's why political intervention, that's why resources are so limited, because we know the answers as communities. And so FIRE and Fighting in Resistance Equally is about all of us as minority groups coming together and actively changing this narrative with everybody that surrounds us, because we are stronger in numbers.
Yeah, and now you're wearing the T-shirt of the Indigenous flag.
This is the Aboriginal flag. So
yes, yeah, and Aboriginal. What does it represent? The colours and the circle.
So the black here is for the people. Mm-hmm. The yellow is for the sun, and the red is for the land and the blood.
The blood of the martyrs.
Blood of the martyrs, and everybody who has passed through. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So institutionalization is literally the result of imperialism and colonization. So institutionalization, in terms of speaking of what happens in our country, is about our young people who are subjected to the system for, let's say, a minor crime, or a minor crime. By crime, we don't even know what the definition of crime is, because there is no proper definition of criminality. It's about institutionalizing our young children. So as I mentioned about out-of-home care, there's a common routine of our young black children going from out-of-home care to juvenile justice to the adult incarcerations, and this is becoming a trend, and it's increasing in numbers. And as I mentioned just before, we're 3.5% of the population, but yet we make up the majority of our institutions. We are the highest numbers in out-of-home care, the highest number in juvenile justice, and the highest number in incarceration. And when you look at these statistics, it does not add up, being the smallest number in the whole country of a race, yet making up the majority of this in our institutions. So institutionalization is happening. It's seeing our young people being profiled. It's over-policing. So when a young person either becomes known or recognized in the system, they're automatically being profiled out throughout the rest of their life. And we have a system that does not support rehabilitation or restoration effectively. So our children and our older Indigenous people are going into these institutions and jails and juvenile justice and they're not being supported with their needs, and most importantly their cultural needs and the intergenerational trauma that comes with not only being Indigenous, but when you're put into these institutions, the lack of support for your cultural needs, because there's a lack of respect for the Indigenous people, and there's a limited support for the culture that we come from. And so deaths in custody is a massive thing that's happening in our communities. We've had, since the Royal Commission in 1998 and 1999, that first year saw 100 deaths of Indigenous people occur. Not one recommendation did our government implement, not one recommendation. Just recently we had another Royal Commission into juvenile justice centres, which is happening in the Northern Territory. The Northern Territory has its whole new government regime up there. This sees young people criminalised and subjected to these institutions at a very, very young age, some as young as 10, and then of course coming from either the out-of-home care system or being recognised from being over-policed and then ending up in juvenile justice. Our young people in the Northern Territory, so we just had a Royal Commission into the Northern Territory juvenile justice. Not many recommendations have been implemented, except for one, which I've heard of, and there may have been others. I haven't read into it just recently, but one that I have just read, it's seeing the closure of one of the most torture centres in the Northern Territory, which is Dondale, and they're closing this centre, except they're spending $70 million on building another prison system. Anybody who has in their head the ideology of building a 4x4 room to rehabilitate a torture centre to rehabilitate our children and our adults and just any human being has the wrong idea and has the wrong narrative, because we know that doesn't provide healing, it doesn't build communities, doesn't support individuals, doesn't support groups, and it's literally another genocidal act of assimilating and segregating us from our culture and our community and where we are and where we're from. We have a lot of our Indigenous people held on remand, which means they're not even found guilty, and yet they're held on these long remand periods because they're not provided with the most effective legal advice, because our government is stripping resources from our legal aid to provide this assistance to Indigenous people and also to non-Indigenous people. But of course, Indigenous people are making up the highest rate in remand, and of course this is leading to deaths in custody because of the over-policing and the abuse and the torture that happens in these places, because it's run by, unfortunately.
Now, history and presence of Indigenous Australia and its current connectedness to the Palestinian movement. How can you wrap it up?
How can I wrap it up? So with the Palestinian movement and obviously what we experienced in our country, there were the two countries in the world that fell under the doctrine of terra nullius. There's the two countries in the world that fell under the title of land unoccupied. This is so close to home for our people in Indigenous Australia and what the Palestinians are facing in their communities, because their refugees are our reservations and missions. Their struggles are our struggles, and so the dispossession and the colonisation and the imperialism and being disconnected from their main homeland. Today we saw it. We went to the Blue Line, and from that line is
the so-called Blue Line.
The so-called Blue Line,
Yes.
But really it's the line of murder, dispossession and removing the Palestinians from their land, which they rightfully have ownership to. And we saw that, and we have the same struggle that we fight with land rights back in our communities, and that's the same struggle that the Palestinians are facing here with the apartheid racial regimes that exist in Palestine. So seeing that, and obviously having our own personal struggles back home, it's just a reminder that we have to stand in solidarity because we share that commonality of struggle with one another.
Right. Vanessa Turnbull Roberts, a young Indigenous leader and activist from Australia. Many thanks indeed. We're going to stop now for a short break, and then afterwards we're going to be joined also by an Indigenous lady from the Red Nation. She's also going to talk about their suffering and their connectedness to the Palestinian cause and the right of return, but after the break, ma'am. إذن فاصل قصير ونعود. لا تذهبوا بعيدا.
ميليسا قيادية منظمة في الأمة الحمراء أو The Red Nation تخبرنا أكثر عن هذا التحالف وماهيته وعن حركة تحرر السكان الأصليين اليوم والتضامن مع الكفاح الفلسطيني.
The Red Nation is a organization with students, academics, workers, natives, non-natives. We are here to advocate for indigenous life and land in what is the so-called United States.
Now, what do you focus on through the Red Nation? What kind of activities do you work on?
We have.
Is it only educative, or what kind of activities?
We have a number of different ways that we facilitate grassroots education and on-the-ground organizing. So we have stuff like protests, rallies, marches. We have educational forums, and we've had tribunal type stuff on border town racism. We've also done donation drives for our unsheltered relatives.
As you said, also there have been lots of Palestinian solidarity efforts in the indigenous communities, okay, particularly among youngsters. Let's explain how these efforts have the potential to expand and strengthen US-based Palestine solidarity movements. The US-based Palestine solidarity movement, your efforts, how would they strengthen and expand?
Well, I feel like
for example, if you can explain the Dineh solidarity with Palestine effort in this sense.
Dineh solidarity with Palestine, I actually believe that came out of organizing work that some of my comrades did. I don't know if you're familiar, but she's one of the co-founders of the Red Nation. Her name is Melanie Yazzie, and also Andrew Curley. He's part of the Red Nation, and what they did is in response to then Navajo President Ben Shelley, they came forward and did actions to oppose his partnership with Israel. And so coming out of that, I've seen Palestine solidarity happen in places like Standing Rock. We had a Palestinian delegation come all the way out to show solidarity with the natives there. And I could see how successful that can be, judging by the people, the crowd who showed up. I feel like there was energy that night, and people commented they learned things that they didn't know before. And from there, we've decided maybe we could move forward with a BDS resolution of some sort.
How does this bring in this solidarity and this fight for Palestine from the US? And how did it affect the human, environmental, and social aspect of your issues?
Comparative analysis between the Palestinians and indigenous peoples in the Americas. It's very imperative to point that out, because we need to build solidarity networks across all oppressed groups. And so the state of Israel would not exist without settler colonialism happening in the United States. So in that way, our struggle is bound to Palestinian struggle. And it's important that we do come together and overthrow what is imperialism, what is continued attempts of erasure of the indigenous populations in where I'm from, and also in Palestine. And
how is the life like for a Native American today in the US of A?
The life for a Native American in the United States today, I would say we definitely struggle from a lot of atrocities that have resulted from settler colonialism. There's just the fact that Native Americans are the racial group most likely to be killed by law enforcement has a lot of implications for us and the health of our people. And I probably would also compare the mass incarceration of Indigenous youth in the United States is comparative in some ways to the incarceration of Palestinian youth. And
like Ahd al-Tamimi and many other child prisoners, so to say. Now, allow me here to ask you something that, let's go back to your visit to the region. I think that one of your prime goals is to focus on building with youth. Why with youth?
Yeah, I think the youth they hold a lot of promise for the future. They're going to carry on the work that we're doing, social justice works, just like we are carrying on the work of our ancestors. And it was actually the youth who got, Standing Rock started. They had a run from Standing Rock all the way to Washington, D.C., and that gained a lot of attention and momentum for the Indigenous liberation movement in the United States.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
I would just like to say that, on behalf of the Red Nation, we do, stand in solidarity with Palestine, and we're going to continue doing this work to expose what the settler empires are committing. Like, they're committing ongoing genocide against our people, in the United States and also in Palestine. And we want to link our struggles so that we as a people could be stronger and overthrow imperialism. And
Inshallah, hopefully.
Yes.
Hopefully. Bless your heart, Meilysa. Always you're welcome at Al-Mayadeen and at من الداخل, and many thanks indeed for joining us, ma'am.
Oh, thank you.
Always welcome, ma'am. إذا لقاء جديد في الأسبوع المقبل مع ضيف جديد وقضية جديدة ودائما من الداخل. للمزيد من التواصل بريدنا theinsight@almayadeen.net وصفحتنا على الفيسبوك من الداخل، من كل فريق العمل من كل الميادين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.